Before we begin this journey together, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and join our community of seekers. Your subscription helps us continue creating content that matters. Now let us proceed. The morning arrived without ceremony, as mornings often do, casting its indifferent light upon a man who had spent his entire existence in pursuit of understanding. Marcus Aurelius Chun, named by parents who had hoped their classical reference would somehow inoculate their son against the mediocrity they themselves had endured, sat at the edge of his unmade bed, staring at the eviction notice that trembled slightly in his hands. The paper seemed almost translucent in the early light, as though it were already fading into the realm of things that no longer mattered, things that had passed beyond the jurisdiction of present concern. For 37 years, Marcus had dedicated himself to the life of the mind. He had pursued advanced degrees in philosophy, published papers in obscure journals read by perhaps a dozen scholars worldwide, and taught undergraduates who regarded his courses as unfortunate requirements standing between them and their true vocational aspirations. He had chosen this path with full awareness of its material limitations, believing, as he had once written in a youthful essay, that the examined life was worth any sacrifice, any deprivation, any postponement of conventional success. Yet here, in this moment of reckoning, holding evidence of his failure to meet the most basic obligations of survival, Marcus found himself questioning everything he had constructed so carefully over the decades. The eviction notice was not merely a legal document demanding his departure from the small apartment he had occupied for 8 years. It was a verdict rendered by reality itself, a judgment that his entire approach to existence had been fundamentally miscalculated. The previous months had witnessed a cascade of losses that seemed almost designed by some cosmic playwright with a taste for irony. First, the university had eliminated his position, citing budget constraints and declining enrollment in humanities programs. The letter had been professionally apologetic, acknowledging his contributions while making clear that such contributions were insufficient to justify his continued employment. Then his father had died, unexpectedly, and without the reconciliation Marcus had always imagined would someday occur between them. The man who had called philosophy professional daydreaming, and who had predicted exactly this outcome for his impractical son, had departed the world with his prophecies seemingly validated. Within weeks of his father's death, Marcus's long-term relationship had dissolved. Elena, who had endured years of his abstraction and financial instability, had finally exhausted her capacity for patience. She had not left in anger but in a kind of weary resignation that was somehow more devastating than rage would have been. "I love who you are," she had said, "but I cannot continue building a life on questions that have no answers." The door had closed behind her with a soft click that echoed in Marcus's memory with the finality of a tomb being sealed. Now, with his savings depleted, his professional identity revoked, and his personal connections severed, Marcus faced the stark reality of homelessness. The word itself seemed to carry a weight far beyond its literal meaning. To be without a home was to be without a place in the social order, without the basic coordinates by which society located and recognized an individual. He had 48 hours to vacate the premises or face legal consequences. Marcus set the notice aside and moved through his apartment, observing his possessions with a strange detachment. The books that lined every wall, many of them annotated in his careful handwriting, represented decades of intellectual accumulation. First editions of Heidegger, complete works of Spinoza, commentaries on Kant that he had once considered indispensable to his understanding. All of it now seemed like ballast he could no longer afford to carry. The furniture was minimal and worn, acquired second-hand and maintained indifferently. His clothing occupied a single closet, most items faded from repeated washing. He owned no television, no car, no objects of significant monetary value. His entire material existence could be catalogued in an afternoon. What struck him most forcefully was how little any of it seemed to matter. The books that had formed the foundation of his intellectual life, the papers and notes documenting years of careful thought, the modest artifacts of daily living. All of it appeared suddenly insubstantial, like props in a play that had closed without notice. He had imagined that his life was about ideas, about the pursuit of truth and wisdom, but standing amid these physical remnants, he could not escape the recognition that he had also been accumulating, hoarding, building walls of paper and interpretation between himself and some reality he had never quite confronted directly. That afternoon, Marcus began the process of dismantling his life. He called a used bookstore and arranged for them to purchase his collection. The amount they offered was insultingly small, but he accepted without negotiation. He contacted a charity organization to collect his furniture. He filled garbage bags with papers, notebooks, and the detritus of abandoned projects. With each item he discarded or sold, he felt an unexpected lightening, as though he were shedding weight he had not known he was carrying. By evening, the apartment stood nearly empty. The books were gone, the furniture removed, the walls bare of the prints and quotations he had hung for inspiration. Marcus sat on the floor in the center of the vacant living room, surrounded by the echoes of his footsteps, and experienced something he had not anticipated: relief. The possessions that had defined his identity, the material evidence of his intellectual journey, had been dispersed, and in their absence, he found not grief but a strange freedom. That night, his last in the apartment, Marcus did not sleep. He sat by the window and watched the city lights blur and shift as darkness deepened. He thought about the classical philosophers he had studied, many of whom had embraced poverty as a condition of clarity. Diogenes living in his barrel, Socrates wandering Athens without concern for comfort or security, the Stoics who taught that external circumstances held no power over the individual who had cultivated inner freedom. These were not merely historical curiosities but examples of a possibility he had somehow failed to seriously consider despite years of study. He had read their words, analyzed their arguments, taught their philosophies to indifferent students, yet he had never truly internalized their most radical insight, that the loss of everything external might be the prerequisite for discovering what was genuinely essential. He had treated philosophy as an academic discipline, a professional specialization, a way of making a living while pursuing interesting questions. He had never imagined it as a way of living itself, a practice that might transform the practitioner rather than merely informing his opinions. When morning came, Marcus walked out of the apartment carrying a single backpack containing a change of clothes, some basic necessities, and one book, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the emperor philosopher whose name his parents had borrowed in their hopes for him. He left his keys on the kitchen counter and closed the door behind him without looking back. The city into which Marcus emerged seemed both familiar and strange. He had lived here for over a decade, yet he had experienced it primarily as a backdrop to his interior life, a stage upon which his thoughts played out. Now, without a destination or purpose beyond immediate survival, he began to see it differently. The streets teemed with people engaged in the urgent business of their lives, each following trajectories shaped by desires, fears, obligations, and dreams he could only imagine. He had spent years analyzing abstract concepts of human existence while remaining curiously isolated from the concrete reality of other lives being lived around him. Marcus walked without direction, allowing the city's rhythms to carry him. He passed shops opening for the day, workers hurrying toward their obligations, parents shepherding children toward schools. He observed the intricate choreography of urban life, the unspoken rules and patterns that allowed millions of people to coexist in proximity without constant collision. He had written papers about social contract theory and the philosophical foundations of community, but watching a stranger hold a door for an elderly woman, he glimpsed something his theoretical frameworks had failed to capture: the small, constant acts of recognition and care that actually sustained human society. By midday, Marcus found himself in a park he had passed countless times without entering. He sat on a bench beneath a large oak tree and opened the Meditations. The pages fell open to a passage he had read many times before, but now the words seemed to speak with a directness they had previously lacked. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. For years, Marcus had interpreted such statements as inspirational rhetoric, useful for encouraging students to maintain perspective during exam stress or personal difficulties. Now, sitting on a park bench with no home, no income, no clear path forward, he understood these words as something far more radical. They were not offering consolation or encouragement. They were describing a fundamental reorientation of consciousness, a shift from seeking control over external circumstances to discovering freedom within any circumstances whatever. A woman sat down on the other end of the bench, unwrapping a sandwich with the focused attention of someone genuinely hungry. Marcus noticed her worn shoes, the bags she carried containing what appeared to be her possessions. She caught him looking and offered a slight nod of acknowledgement. No words passed between them, yet in that moment of recognition, Marcus felt a connection more authentic than many of the conversations he had conducted in academic settings. Here was someone who knew, without need for philosophical elaboration, what it meant to exist without the buffers and securities that most people took for granted. The afternoon passed in a kind of timeless present. Marcus watched children play, observed pigeons competing for scattered breadcrumbs, noticed the way light shifted through the leaves as the sun moved across the sky. These were phenomena he had witnessed countless times, yet he had never truly attended to them. His mind had always been elsewhere, working through arguments, planning future projects, revisiting past conversations. Now, with no future to plan for and a past that had definitively ended, he discovered a quality of attention he had only read about in Buddhist texts, a simple presence to what was actually occurring. As evening approached, Marcus faced a practical question he could no longer defer. Where would he sleep? The prospect of spending the night on the streets filled him with apprehension. He thought of the shelters he had passed without truly seeing, the homeless individuals he had unconsciously stepped around. He had carried vague notions about homeless people, viewing them as victims of circumstances or failures of social policy, but he had never imagined himself among them. The boundary between his former life and this new reality seemed to have dissolved so quickly that he had not had time to develop the psychological defenses that might have cushioned the transition. He remembered reading about a homeless shelter operated by a religious organization several blocks away. The prospect of entering such a place, of publicly acknowledging his new status, required a surrender of pride that was more difficult than surrendering his possessions had been. Yet pride, he recognized, was itself a possession, perhaps the most burdensome one he still carried. What use was philosophical sophistication if it prevented him from seeking basic human assistance when he needed it? Marcus stood and began walking toward the shelter. The streets were changing as day shifted toward night, different populations emerging, different energies animating the urban landscape. He passed restaurants where people gathered for dinners he could no longer afford, bars where workers decompressed from their daily labors, theaters advertising entertainments that belonged to a world he had departed. None of it generated the envy or resentment he might have expected. Instead, he felt a curious neutrality, an observation without judgment or desire. The shelter occupied a converted warehouse in a neighborhood Marcus had never had occasion to visit. A line of people waited outside the entrance, patient and quiet. Marcus joined the line, feeling self-conscious and uncertain. The others waiting seemed to carry their situations with a resignation born of repetition. Some talked quietly among themselves, others stood in silence. A few looked at him with the slight curiosity that a newcomer always attracts, but no one challenged his presence or questioned his right to be there. When Marcus reached the entrance, a volunteer with tired eyes and a kind smile asked for his name and basic information. She explained the rules without condescension. No weapons, no drugs, no violence, respect for others. She handed him a thin blanket and directed him toward the sleeping area. The space was large and echoing, filled with rows of cots separated by minimal distance. The air carried the complex scent of many bodies in proximity, institutional cleaning products, and something else Marcus could not name. Perhaps simply the smell of necessity. He found an unclaimed cot near the back and sat down, still clutching his backpack. Around him, men and women prepared for sleep with the efficiency of established routine. Some read, others stared at phones charging at communal stations, a few conversed in low voices. Marcus noticed an elderly man sitting on the next cot, meticulously organizing his few possessions. Their eyes met, and the man offered a slight smile. "First time?" the man asked, his voice carrying an accent Marcus could not place. Marcus nodded. "Is it that obvious? Everyone has a first time. You'll get used to it." The man extended his hand. "I'm Joseph." They shook hands, and Marcus introduced himself. Joseph had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent considerable time without adequate shelter, but his eyes held an alertness that suggested an active interior life. Marcus learned that Joseph had been an engineer before a series of health problems and job losses had gradually eroded his stability. He spoke of this trajectory without self-pity, as though describing events that had happened to someone else. "The hardest part," Joseph said, "is not the discomfort or the uncertainty. It's letting go of who you thought you were. Once you do that, it gets easier." These words struck Marcus with unexpected force. Joseph had articulated precisely the struggle Marcus had been experiencing without fully recognizing it. His entire identity had been constructed around his role as a philosopher, a teacher, and intellectual. Without those external markers, without the institutional structures that had validated his sense of self, he was confronting a more fundamental question. Who was he, stripped of all the stories he had told about himself? That night, lying on the thin mattress beneath the inadequate blanket, surrounded by the sounds of strangers sleeping, snores, coughs, murmurs, the shuffling of bodies seeking comfort, Marcus found sleep elusive. Yet the wakefulness was not tormented. Instead, he lay in a state of alert presence, aware of each sensation, each sound, each thought arising and passing in his consciousness. He noticed how the mind constantly generated narratives, interpretations, judgments. He observed how it reached backward into memory and forward into imagination, rarely settling into the simple fact of the present moment. Hours passed in this observation. Marcus made no effort to control or direct his thoughts, simply noting them as they appeared. Gradually, he noticed something subtle but significant. There was an awareness that witnessed the thoughts but was not identical with them. The fears, regrets, and anxieties that moved through his mind were real enough, but they were not the totality of his being. Something in him observed all of this interior, whether without being swept away by it. As dawn light began filtering through the high windows of the shelter, Marcus experienced a moment of clarity that would later seem impossible to adequately describe. It was not a mystical vision or a dramatic revelation, nothing that could be easily packaged into the kind of transformative insight spiritual literature often promised. Rather, it was a simple recognition. He was still here, still conscious, still capable of experience, despite having lost everything he had once considered essential to his existence. The possessions were gone, the status was gone, the identity was gone, yet something remained. Not a self in the conventional sense, not the Marcus Aurelius Chun who had accumulated degrees and published papers, but something more fundamental. An awareness, a capacity for experience, a presence that existed prior to and independent of all the stories and structures that had seemed so necessary. Marcus rose from his cot and joined the others preparing to leave the shelter for the day. The volunteers distributed coffee and simple pastries. Marcus accepted his portion gratefully, experiencing the taste of the bitter coffee with an intensity that surprised him. When had he last actually tasted coffee rather than merely consuming it as fuel while his mind worked on other things? He spent that day walking through the city with no agenda. He discovered parts of the urban landscape he had never noticed. Small parks tucked between buildings, community gardens maintained by neighborhood volunteers, free public spaces where people gathered without commercial transaction. He sat on steps and watched the flow of life, finding himself genuinely interested in the faces passing by, the fragments of conversation, the small dramas playing out in public. In a public library, Marcus spent several hours reading, but not philosophy. Instead, he read poetry, finding in the concentrated language and careful attention to experience something he had missed in his years of abstract analysis. He read Mary Oliver observing a grasshopper, Rumi celebrating the wound through which light enters, Rilke instructing the young poet to live the questions. These writers were not constructing arguments or defending positions. They were bearing witness to existence with a directness that all his philosophical sophistication had somehow obscured. As days became weeks, Marcus developed rhythms and practices. He spent mornings in quiet observation, often sitting in parks or public spaces, simply watching. He spent afternoons walking, discovering the city's hidden corners and observing its inhabitants with genuine curiosity. He spent evenings in the library or occasional community centers that offered free programs. He returned each night to the shelter, where he had begun building tentative connections with others navigating similar circumstances. Joseph became a regular companion. The two men would walk together, conversing about their lives and observations. Marcus discovered that Joseph possessed a wisdom born not from books but from direct encounter with difficulty. When Marcus expressed concern about his lack of employment or direction, Joseph would listen patiently and then offer perspectives that cut through Marcus's tendency toward abstraction. "You're still thinking like someone who has lost something," Joseph observed one afternoon. "What if you've been freed from something instead?" This reframing opened new possibilities in Marcus's thinking. What if his losses were not deficits but subtractions that revealed what remained? What if the stripped-down existence he now inhabited was not a diminishment but a clarification? The questions felt dangerous, potentially justifying a surrender that might simply be another form of failure. Yet they also held an attraction he could not deny. Marcus began to notice that his mind, deprived of its usual objects and occupations, was becoming clearer. Without constant stimulation, without the endless stream of information and analysis that had characterized his academic life, he experienced longer stretches of simple presence. Walking became a form of meditation. Eating the simple meals provided at the shelter became an exercise in attention. Even the discomfort of cold nights and hard surfaces became opportunities to observe the mind's reactions without being controlled by them. One day, Marcus encountered a group gathered in a park for what appeared to be a community discussion circle. A sign announced, "Philosophy in the Park, Open Dialogue." Curious, he joined the gathering. About 15 people sat in a rough circle on the grass, ranging from college-age students to elderly retirees. A woman in her 60s facilitated the discussion, posing questions and encouraging participants to explore their responses. The topic that day was happiness. What was it? How could it be achieved? Did it require external circumstances or was it a choice? The discussion unfolded with an authenticity Marcus had rarely encountered in academic settings. These were not philosophers performing expertise but human beings genuinely wrestling with questions that mattered to their lives. Marcus listened without speaking at first, struck by the directness of the exchange. A young woman described struggling with anxiety despite having what she called everything I'm supposed to want. An older man talked about finding unexpected contentment after retirement, despite reduced income and social status. A middle-aged teacher questioned whether the pursuit of happiness itself might be a trap, diverting attention from more meaningful goals. When Marcus finally spoke, he did not identify himself as a philosopher or cite authorities. Instead, he shared his recent experience, losing everything and discovering that some essential quality of being remained. He described the strange liberation that had emerged from having nothing left to lose. He acknowledged his uncertainty about where this would lead, admitting that he did not know whether what he was experiencing was wisdom or merely a rationalization of failure. The group listened with attention that felt honoring rather than judgmental. Several people nodded in recognition. The facilitator thanked him for his honesty and noted that his experience illustrated something the ancient Stoics had taught, that we cannot control external circumstances, but we can control our relationship to those circumstances. After the discussion ended, several people approached Marcus to continue the conversation. They asked questions about his background, his current situation, his thoughts on various philosophical topics. Marcus found himself in the unexpected position of teaching again, but in a context stripped of institutional authority. Here, his knowledge mattered only insofar as it proved useful to people genuinely seeking understanding. The validation came not from credentials or publications but from the quality of exchange itself. The facilitator, whose name was Margaret, asked if Marcus would be interested in co-leading future sessions. She explained that the group had been meeting for 5 years, creating a space for philosophical exploration outside academic or religious institutions. They welcomed diverse perspectives and valued lived experience as much as theoretical knowledge. Marcus agreed, feeling something stir in him that he had not experienced in years, a sense of purpose that arose from direct connection rather than professional obligation. In the following weeks, he became a regular participant in the philosophy circle, sometimes facilitating discussions, often simply contributing as an equal participant. He discovered that his years of study had value when placed in service of genuine dialogue rather than academic performance. Through Margaret and the Philosophy Circle, Marcus met others involved in various community initiatives. He began volunteering at the shelter where he slept, helping new arrivals navigate the system and find resources. He assisted at a community kitchen, preparing and serving meals. He joined a group that distributed supplies to homeless individuals who did not or could not access shelter services. These activities gave structure to his days and connected him to a network of people engaged in direct service. Marcus discovered that many of them were, like him, living with very little material security. They were artists, activists, spiritual seekers, and individuals who had chosen or been forced into lives outside conventional economic structures. What they shared was a commitment to values beyond accumulation and status. Among these new acquaintances was a woman named Sarah, who ran a small nonprofit focused on literacy and education for homeless youth. She had been a corporate attorney before walking away from that career to pursue work she found meaningful. When Marcus mentioned his teaching background, she immediately asked if he would be willing to tutor some of the young people her organization served. Marcus began meeting weekly with several teenagers who had dropped out of school for various reasons. He helped them prepare for equivalency exams, but more importantly, he listened to their stories and treated them with a respect they rarely encountered. These young people were not statistics or social problems. They were individuals navigating complex circumstances with whatever resources they could muster. Marcus found himself learning as much from them as they learned from him. One of his students, a 17-year-old named David who had been living in shelters since his mother's death 2 years earlier, possessed a sharp analytical mind and a hunger for understanding. Marcus lent him his copy of the Meditations, the only book he still owned. David read it voraciously and returned days later full of questions about Stoic philosophy and its applicability to his circumstances. Their conversations ranged across philosophy, history, literature, and life. David spoke of his determination to finish his education and create a different future for himself, but also of his doubts and fears. Marcus shared his own recent experiences of loss and discovery, not as a teacher dispensing wisdom, but as a fellow human being navigating uncertainty. "The thing is," David said one afternoon, "everyone acts like being homeless is the worst thing that can happen to you. And yeah, it's hard. But it's also taught me things I wouldn't have learned any other way. Like who actually cares about you when you have nothing to offer them. Like how much you can do without and still be okay." Marcus recognized in David's words an echo of his own evolving understanding. The losses that seemed catastrophic from one perspective created possibilities for discovery from another. This was not to romanticize poverty or suffering, not to suggest that material security did not matter. Rather, it was to acknowledge that crisis could sometimes crack open spaces for transformation that comfort kept sealed. Months passed in this fashion. Marcus continued sleeping at the shelter, continued his involvement with the Philosophy Circle and various volunteer activities, continued his tutoring and conversations with David and other young people. He lived on very little money, earned through odd jobs and occasional paid tutoring. His possessions remained minimal. He owned 3 changes of clothes, basic toiletries, and still just the one book. Yet he did not feel deprived. His days were full of connection, conversation, and purpose. He experienced the city intimately, knowing its rhythms and hidden spaces. He had developed friendships based on genuine affinity rather than professional networking. He was teaching and learning in ways that felt alive and relevant. The freedom from worry about status or career advancement had opened space for attention to what was actually occurring in each moment. This is not to say that Marcus did not struggle. There were nights when the cold penetrated even his inadequate blanket, when he lay awake questioning his choices and fearing for his future. There were days when the grinding reality of poverty wore down his philosophical equanimity, when he felt the weight of social invisibility that came with homelessness. There were moments when he doubted whether his current existence represented wisdom or simply failure dressed in spiritual language. But even these struggles taught him something. He learned to observe his own reactivity, to notice when he was creating suffering through resistance to circumstances rather than simply experiencing difficulty. He discovered that thoughts were just thoughts, emotions just emotions, real enough in their moment but not fixed or permanent. He found that he could endure far more than he had imagined when he stopped fighting reality and simply met it as it was. One evening, after a philosophy circle discussion about meaning and purpose, Margaret asked Marcus to stay behind. She had a proposition for him. Her organization had received a small grant to develop educational programs, and she wanted Marcus to design and facilitate a course on practical philosophy for people experiencing homelessness and economic insecurity. It would not pay much, but it would provide modest income and an opportunity to do work that mattered. Marcus felt a complex response to this offer. Part of him immediately grasped for it as validation, as evidence that he had not completely failed, as a pathway back toward security and status. But another part recognized this very grasping as the same pattern of seeking external validation that had characterized his entire life before his losses. He thanked Margaret and asked for time to consider. That night, lying in his cot at the shelter, Marcus reflected on what had changed in him. 6 months earlier, such an offer would have seemed like salvation. Now, while he appreciated it and recognized its value, he did not need it to confirm his worth or direction. Whether he accepted it or not, he would continue to be who he had discovered himself to be. Someone capable of presence, connection, and service regardless of circumstances. The next morning, Marcus walked to his usual spot in the park where he sat for an hour each day in quiet observation. The autumn air carried a chill that announced the approaching winter. Leaves drifted down from the trees in slow spirals. Other people moved through the park on their morning routines. Marcus sat and breathed and watched, not seeking insight or understanding, simply being present to what was. Into this stillness came a recognition, not dramatic or life-changing, but clear and undeniable. He had not lost everything and gained peace as though one were the price of the other. Rather, losing everything had revealed that peace was possible without anything, that it had been available all along but obscured by his attachment to possessions, status, identity, and the constant seeking that had characterized his former life. The possessions had not prevented peace. The career had not prevented peace. The relationships and plans and projects had not prevented peace. What had prevented peace was his belief that peace depended on having or achieving these things, his conviction that he would be complete once he had accomplished certain goals or secured certain conditions. Now, with none of those external supports, peace remained possible. Not constant, not perfect, not free from difficulty or doubt, but real nonetheless. It arose not from having everything he wanted but from releasing the demand that circumstances be other than they were. It came from recognizing that this moment, whatever it contained, was enough. Not because it was perfect, but because it was what was actually occurring. Marcus rose from his bench and began walking, carrying this recognition lightly. He would accept Margaret's offer and see what emerged from it. He would continue his volunteer work and his conversations with David and others. He would keep sleeping at the shelter and living with minimal possessions. He would remain present to whatever unfolded, not passive or resigned, but responsive to life as it presented itself rather than constantly trying to force it into conformity with his plans. As he walked through the city that had become his classroom and his home, Marcus understood that the question was not whether he had made the right choices or whether his losses had been worth it. Such calculations presumed a fixed standard of value, a final accounting where wisdom could be measured against worldly success. Instead, the question was whether he could remain awake to his actual experience, whether he could continue learning from whatever arose, whether he could extend to himself and others the compassion that made human existence bearable and occasionally beautiful. The philosopher had lost everything he thought defined him, and in that loss had discovered what remained when all definitions fell away. Not a perfect peace, not an end to all struggle, but a fundamental okayness that existed beneath and through the constantly changing circumstances of life. This okayness did not solve all problems or answer all questions. It simply made it possible to continue, to engage, to care, and to contribute without requiring that everything turn out a certain way. Marcus walked on through the autumn morning, a man without a home in the conventional sense but not without a place in the world. His place was here, in this moment, in this body, in this awareness that witnessed all arising and passing. His place was in connection with others who shared this strange journey of being human. His place was in the questions he continued to live rather than trying to definitively answer. The story would continue, as stories do, with new challenges and changes, new losses and discoveries. But something fundamental had shifted. Marcus had stopped running from his life and had begun, finally, to live it. Not the life he had planned or the life he had thought he wanted, but the life that was actually his to live in each unfolding moment. And in that acceptance, that surrender of control in favor of presence, he had found not everything he wanted, but something more essential. The peace that comes from being fully, honestly, courageously alive.